Beginning our discussion of the fourth step. Okay, if you have your big books, please open them up to page 63. We're going to be looking at the last full paragraph on page 63 because it is in part a lead-in to the fourth step. Last full paragraph on page 63. We found it very desirable to take this spiritual step, that is the third step, with an understanding person such as our wife, best friend, or spiritual advisor. Now, by the way, the word spiritual advisor, as it appears here, did not necessarily refer to a member of the fellowship, and I suppose in most cases it did not, because many of the original members had spiritual advisors who were clergy or people who had some kind of spiritual connection with the member, but was not necessarily a member himself or herself. But it is better to meet God alone than with one who might misunderstand. The wording was, of course, quite optional so long as we expressed the idea, voicing it without reservation. That little phrase, without reservation, is of extreme importance. Now, of course, it's talking about the third step prayer, which we studied last week. This prayer is offered up, holding nothing back. The phrase in the fifth step is withholding nothing, without reservations. In other words, when we say to God, that we're offering ourselves to Him to build with us and to do with us as He wills, we mean that in the entirety of its full meaning. Our lives we are now dedicating to God and His will. It's kind of like this: here I am, God, take me. We're not holding back our sex life or our business life or our sports life or any part of our lives. Without reservation, we're making the offer to God. Then it goes on to say, this was only a beginning. Though if honestly and humbly made, an effect, sometimes a very great one, was felt at once. Please note, this is only a beginning. And there are a lot of people who seem to make the mistake that the third step prayer is a prayer upon which, and the use of which will keep them sober. And the big book seems to run directly contrary to that. My experience tells me that that's not necessarily true. In fact, I've never seen it to be true. Because this third step is, as it says here, just the beginning. Going on now on page 63. This next paragraph is a lead-in to the fourth step and contains information which is quite profound and extremely necessary for us to understand. Next, we launched out on a course of vigorous action, the first step of which is a personal house cleaning, which many of us had never attempted. Though our decision, that's the decision of the third step, was a vital and crucial step, it could have little permanent effect unless at once, followed by a strenuous effort to face and to be rid of the things in ourselves which have been blocking us. Our liquor was but a symptom, so we had to get down to causes and conditions. You know, the big book is entirely consistent from one end to the other. Oh, there may be some little glitches back there in the stories. Some of the news stories seem to be a little bit odd to me, but then I'm a dinosaur. And I know that. But in the first 164 pages, in the doctor's opinion and the forwards, we find total consistency. When the big book tells us, it is telling us right here that liquor was but a symptom, it means precisely what it's saying. We don't cure an illness by curing the symptom. we cure the illness and the symptom goes away. Our problem, as we have already discovered, is that we are spiritually bankrupt, that we lack the power to recover on our own, and that this book was written for us so that it would enable us to find a power greater than ourselves which would solve our problem. So our liquor was but a symptom. In another place in the big book it tells us that alcohol, the bottle was but a symbol. And so we're looking now at getting on with this, getting down to causes and conditions. And therefore we started on a personal inventory. This was step 4. A word about inventory, guys, because we're going to see inventory twice more in the steps, aren't we? In the 10th step and again in the 11th step. If you were a shopkeeper, you wouldn't think of going into your storeroom and out in the shelves in your showroom, try to take inventory of your goods in your head. You just wouldn't do it. I suppose there are some geniuses around who could do that, but that probably isn't any of us. And so we write it down. An inventory is a written list. And so when we're talking here now about taking inventory, we're talking about doing some writing. And a business which takes no regular inventory usually goes broke. Taking a commercial inventory is a fact-finding and fact-facing process. It is an effort to discover the truth about the stock and trade. Listen to that, the truth about stock and trade. When we take inventory in Alcoholics Anonymous, it is a search for the truth about ourselves. It is not a search for the truth about others in the sense of condemnation or blame. It is not an attempt to indict ourselves. We're not here to make ourselves wrong. We're doing this to find out what is wrong with us, the truth about what's going on with us, the things which have caused and contributed to our failures in life, the things which constitute in their total our insanity, our spiritual weakness, and our emotional immaturity. And so as we do the work of the 4th step, that's what we're doing. We're looking for these things which we must find in order to be freed from them. Going on. Our object is to disclose damaged or unsaleable goods, to get rid of them promptly and without regret. That's, of course, an allegory for what we're doing. Our defects of character, we wish to find the ones that need to go. We will get rid of them without regret. If the owner of the business is to be successful, he cannot fool himself about values. Remember, the first paragraph of chapter 5 is real important to keep in mind, because it tells us that we can't recover if we're not willing or have the ability to be honest with ourselves. Self-delusion has been one of the hallmarks of our disease. And so, if we're to be successful in recovery, we cannot fool ourselves about what's going on with us. We did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws in our makeup which caused our failure. You see, the big book is not saying first we look to see what kind of a rotten, stinking person we were. It may be true that we were, but so what? That's not the point of the 4th step. The point of the 4th step is to find out what about us. What are what's the symptomology here? What are these things which block us from God? Now, it makes a lot of sense what we're doing here if we go back to basics again. Remember, in the 1st step, we came to understand and to accept the fact, as a fact, in our innermost selves, that we're alcoholics and all that that entails. Alcoholism being an incurable, invariably fatal and progressive illness. We came to accept the fact that we had no power over alcohol. We're powerless. We can't stop drinking on our own. And all of the people around these rooms who say to us, just don't drink and go to meetings, they're whistling Dixie. Why would I say to you, don't drink, when I know that you can't not drink? That is, you've admitted your alcoholism. You've admitted that you're powerless over alcohol. And the big book says that our willpower fails utterly. And so we searched out the flaws in our makeup which caused our failure. Being convinced that self, this is very important now, because we just studied this in the third step, remember? Being convinced that self, manifested in various ways, was what had defeated us, we considered its common manifestations. So what we're going to be looking at now as we go through the fourth step and the fifth step is the manifestations of self. Selfishness, self-centeredness, self-centered fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, all of those aspects of self. And when you really look at it, if you consider self as being pretty much all-encompassing, pride seems to fall right in there. Pride being a manifestation of self. Overwhelming selfishness and self-centeredness, being completely immersed in self. The basics then teach us that we cannot recover without the help of a higher power because we're powerless. Therefore, the big book says that we're going to seek out this higher power. And so, searching out the flaws means that we're looking for our defects of character, our insanities, and our guilt and remorse and shame, as that is reflected in the harm that we have done others. Remember that we found out that we are the authors of our own misery, that our troubles are of our own making, that they arise out of ourselves, and an alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot. Remember, we also found out that we had to be rid of self. We had to, or it would kill us. And that there's no way of getting rid of self on our own, that we had to have God's help. We're as powerless over self as we are over alcohol. It's a powerful message that we have already assimilated in the third step. And here we have the backup. We're extrapolating forward now, being convinced that self, manifested in various ways, was what had defeated us. We considered its common manifestations. We call these common manifestations defects of character. Going on, resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease. For we have been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. And now here comes the capstone. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. Please, take that sentence literally, because it is literally true. One of the things which is so important for us to understand that there is nothing past God's power. I have seen miracles of physical and mental recovery which boggle the minds of the professionals. They cannot explain what has happened. But we're pretty sure what's happening here. We're looking at a miracle. Miracles are commonplace in Alcoholics Anonymous. Matter of fact, it's probably true. It certainly seems so to me that the second great miracle of our lives is when we were brought in the door, the first being when we were born. We're given something that for each one of us in here, there are 10 people out there that don't have and never will have. Why us? God isn't talking about that. But he certainly tells us through the steps in the big book what he expects of us, which is that we become of maximum service to him and the people about us, to carry his message to other alcoholics. In dealing with resentments, we set them down on paper. We listed people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry. We asked ourselves why we were angry. In most cases, it was found that our self-esteem, our pocketbooks, our ambitions, our personal relationships, including sex, were hurt or threatened. So we were sore, we were burned up. Now, before we get into the resentment list itself, let's look at the 4-step and see what it is we're looking at here. First of all, the 4-step is designed to uncover, to reveal to us through our inventory, the existence of what I call 4 cardinal defects. Now, you may call them anything you want or not call them anything, doesn't matter. But for purposes of identification now, the 4 cardinal defects are resentment, dishonesty, selfishness, and fear. We're going to find these same defects in the 10th step, inventory, and again in the 11th step, inventory, these precisely same defects. When we look at the 4th step, we will find that it is broken down into 4 parts. And each of those 4 parts is designed to show us one or more of these defects as they exist in us. Remember that we're looking at our present reality now. We're looking to see what it is today that is blocking us off from God. Therefore, when we look at the first section of the 4th step, we find that this is all about resentments. There is a corollary, of course, which is that fear is always involved with anger and resentment, and we are able to see that when we do our resentment list. But basically, the first part of the 4th step has us look at our resentments. But it goes beyond that. Not only do we find whom we resent and what they did to cause our resentments, how they harmed us, what the wrongs were, but we are also given the spiritual solution to resentments. So that when we follow the directions in the big book, we're able to be set free from our resentments. Bill said, when asked, how do I know if I did a proper 4th step? He said, if you had any resentments left when you finish it, you didn't do it right. Because we have the complete spiritual answer, the remedy, the solution to our resentments. So we look at our resentments first, and then we apply the spiritual remedy, and we get rid of the resentments, and then we go to the second part of the 4th step, which is a look at ourselves. And in that second part, we're looking for our dishonesty, our selfishness, and our fears. And we do this by looking at our conduct as it relates to those whom we resented. It's a very neat package, because when we do this, we get specific examples of the existence of our selfishness and our dishonesty and our fears. At the same time that we're doing this, we're also making a list of the people we have harmed. Remember that our 8-step list is done in our 4th step. It will not necessarily be complete, but most of it will already be done before we ever get to the 8th step itself. The third part of the 4th step is a list of our fears. And we list our fears, and we list what caused our fears, what was the threat. And then we begin to use the spiritual remedy for fear. And what the big book tells us is that we ask God to remove these fears, and at once we commence to outgrow fear. So we write them down, we write down what caused them, and then we ask God to remove them, and at once we begin to outgrow them. And the 4th part of the 4th step is our sex inventory. And in our sex inventory, we concentrate directly on our dishonesty and our selfishness and our relationships especially our sex relations. We also, by doing that, are able to identify the people we have harmed by our conduct in our relationships with others. As a result of doing this, we're able to discern, with God's help, what should be our ideal for how we are to live our lives in the future, our sex lives, our relationship lives. So those are the 4 parts of the 4th step. Now then, when we do a proper 4th step following the directions in the Big Book, leaving aside entirely all of the forms, whether they emanate from Hazelton, Joe and Charlie, or the local treatment center, if we just stick with the directions in the Big Book, we will have five results from a proper 4th step. First result is we will lose our resentments. Secondly, we will commence to lose our fears. Third, we'll have an ideal for our future sex life. Fourth, we're going to have a list of all the people we've harmed, and we will have become ready to make the amends necessary. And 5, we'll have a list of our defects of character. So now we're going to be taking a look at our resentments. Some resentments that we're carrying around inside of us have been there for years and years and years and years. We're not aware of them except in those rare occasions of deja vu when they come flooding back in. The remedy, the solution to our resentments doesn't have anything to do with us rationalizing away our resentments. What they would like for us to do is to compare what we did to people to what they did to us and say, oh, they weren't so bad after all. And look how bad we were. Or, I wasn't so bad, look what was done to me to make me do all these things. Either way, we love it. But the steps in the Big Book don't indulge in comparative fault for very good reasons. We're not talking about spiritual solutions here. We're talking about a spiritual solution to a spiritual problem. Some of our resentments go back so far into our past that we have very little memory of the events that took place. Some of our resentments are as fresh as this morning. All of our resentments have affected us in some material way, some of them severely. And so, because of the very nature of this beast, which hides out just like cancer cells and metastasizes through our psyche, it's absolutely essential that we take whatever steps necessary, do whatever we must do in order to ferret all this stuff out. If you're sponsoring people, you'll often find them saying, I don't have any resentments. You say, whoa, wait a second. You've already qualified for sainthood, I guess. Let's just see if maybe you do. Another thing you'll run into as a sponsor, maybe you've run into it with yourself. There are people who simply do not want to put the onus on other people. They don't want to make them wrong about anything. They don't want to believe that anything was done that was wrong and harmful. They want to believe that all of this goes back on themselves. And so when we ask them to determine whether what somebody did was harmful or wrong or threatening or made us angry, they're going to deny that any of that happened. The state of denial is not all that uncommon. So we have to find another way to get at that. And we do that by looking to see where they have been unfair. Well, now, if I want to uncover all of the defects of character, all of the resentments that I have, the first thing I've got to do is go back and review the important people in my life. Remember, too, that somebody who's new is having difficulty maybe with their memory. And a lot of the stuff that happened in the past we've blanked out so much that it really isn't right up in the front where we can remember it easily. So we have to have a way of jogging the memory, getting a process of association going, which will allow us then to go back with some specificity and to identify the things that were done to us, so that we're going to be able to find out where these resentments came from. And so the way that we can do that, and this isn't in the book, by the way, but this is what I do, and I'll pass it along to you if you want to use it. I recommend that we sit down first and write out the names of everybody who was ever important or significant in our life, going back to our families, parents, brothers and sisters, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, anybody who had any significant impact on our life from our family, our teachers, employers, friends, boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands or wives, children, jailers, cops, judges, psychiatrists, doctors, the list goes on and on. Whoever has had a significant impact in our lives. When we write these names down, there's a salutary effect in two respects. First of all, it's a non-threatening exercise. We're not doing anything about it yet, so it's a lot easier to kind of ease into doing a four-step when all we're doing is writing down names. Once we have those names down, we want to identify then who it is that we need to write about. That is, we need to find out who it is on this list who qualifies for the resentment list. And the way we do that works best that I've found. We simply answer some questions about each of the people on that list. We ask ourselves, did this person harm me in any way? Did this person wrong me in any way? Did this person threaten me in any way? Did this person anger me in any way? And then we have the one more question that kind of is designed to get around any reluctance we may have. Was this person unfair to me in any way? And I can remember a couple of instances in doing a four-step with a sponsee where the only question that she was willing to answer was the unfairness question. But it turns out that her concept of unfairness cut across all of the aspects of harm and wrongs. So if we go to the resentment list example on page 65, we find that there are three, not four, but three columns. First column is very simple. We write down the name of the person we resent, or the principle, or the institution. In general terms, principles are those things that we were taught or which were insisted upon as being the guiding forces or guiding lights in our life, which we've come to believe were really counter to our best interests. And of course, institutions would encompass such things as the police, the church, the schools, the IRS, and so on and so on and so on. Human institutions that we may have resentments toward. Many people have no abiding resentments in those regards at all, but if we do, we're going to write them down as well as the people. But in the first column then, on the left-hand side of our page, we're going to write down the names of the people we have resentments toward. Notice at the top of that column in italics it says, I'm resentful at. That means I am now, presently, today as I sit here, resentful at. And if we recognize and we are certain that the resentment, whatever it was that we may have had in the past, is gone, we no longer harbor that resentment, if we're sure about that, then of course it's not necessary for us to write about that person. I would caution you, however, that you might want to err on the side of completeness here, because sometimes our minds will play tricks on us and we'll think that we have been freed of resentment when in fact we have not. We don't want to take a chance of leaving anything inside of us which will grow and fester in the future, any more than we would have an operation on our insides to remove a cancer, but tell the surgeon you can take most of it, but you can leave some if you want to. So we're going to be very careful to get it all out. The middle paragraph, the middle column is labeled the cause. Now, in order for us to know what to write there, it's very simple. We go back to our answers to the questions. For example, suppose that in the first column we wrote down Papa. Now we want to know what was the cause of our resentment. We go back to our list and we see that Papa harmed us and wronged us and made us angry. All we're going to need to do now is to write down in that middle column what Papa did that harmed us, what Papa did that wronged us, and what Papa did that made us angry. And we may find that these are one and the same acts, in which case that's fine too. But at least we know what it is that goes into that column. We're going to do that all the way down for everybody on our list when we answered any of those questions yes to. And now we go to the third column, and this is not too well understood, but let's go back to basics here and see what we're looking at. Remember, we learned that we were looking at natural God-given instincts which had been warped and perverted by fear, so that our brains no longer work as God intended, but in fact work against us. We're looking at instincts which have been warped, instincts which no longer function as they should. Therefore, because these are instinctual matters, they operate below the level of conscious thought. We therefore have no power over this stuff, and we need God's help with it. When we look at the wrongs that were done to us, we're looking primarily to see what damage or interference was done to our instincts. So in order to find out what's going to go in that third column, it's very simple. We go to the little paragraph right above the example on page 65. On the grudge list, we set opposite each name our injuries, and then we look to see what it affected. Was it our self-esteem? By the way, self-esteem is not a pejorative term in here. We're talking about our definition of ourselves. We're not talking about walking around with a head full of pride and ego. Self-esteem is that quiet belief that we're okay, that we are in fact good kids of God. So these injuries many times have destroyed our self-esteem, have so warped our image of ourselves, our definition of ourselves, that it no longer even makes any sense. But nevertheless, this is what we've come to think about ourselves, and we need to understand that these actions of others many times have crushed us. An example, of course, is the parent who constantly tells the child, you're no good, you're dumb, you're stupid, you're a failure, you're never going to make it. Or look at your brother, look at your sister, how smart they are and what they're doing. What's the matter with you? And we hear that enough, and there's very little left of any self-esteem we might have otherwise had. The next category is security. And of course, security is one of our natural instincts. Natural instincts for sex, security, and society. And when the harm that others has done has interfered and damaged our sense of security, we need to see that. The next category is ambitions. Now again, ambitions in here, this does not mean the kind of ambitions which are riding over everybody else. It's not a question of being ambitious. We're looking at the vision that we have for ourselves, the vision of where we would like to be and what we would like to do with our lives. And again, the harm that others have done to us may very well have seriously damaged our view of the future and our belief system that would allow us to go forward and to face the the necessary problems and the necessary growth in order to achieve our ambitions. The next two categories, personal relations, refers to our instinct for society, and sex relations, of course, our instinct for sex. Now, the instinct for society is very powerful. You know, a lot of times we talk about our fear of rejection. We always seem to be driven toward being included in and not excluded. One of the worst things that a society can do to its members is to shun them. And there are religious societies which use shunning as a method of punishment. Read the Scarlet Letter. Look what happened to Hester Prynne when she was accused of adultery. She was allowed to stay in the colony, but nobody would speak to her. And she had to wear the scarlet A. This is like a slow death, because our instinct to be included in, to be a part of our society, to be a part of our chosen group is very powerful. And we'll go to almost any lengths to assure our place within our society. And of course, our sex relations being interfered with, here again, this is something that's going to short circuit all of our diodes and whatever else is up there. All of our synapses are going to go nuts when our sex instinct is short circuited and interfered with. This is such a powerful instinct. We know that the sex instinct is good and God-given. We also have to recognize that it's extraordinarily powerful. And this power is something which the commercial world plays upon ad nauseum, because they know that no matter how many times our sex instinct is appealed to, the next guy or next company that comes along and does the same thing will be successful with it. Because this stuff operates below the level of conscious thought. And so when we're looking at our resentments, we are looking to see what this damage, this harm that was done to us, did to our natural instincts. We need to get a clear picture of how all of this stuff works and how the damage was created to us without ameliorating or excusing or in any way fogging out what was done to us. It's critically important that we write down here the exact nature of the wrongs that were done to us, because it is necessary for us to have widescreen, Technicolor, stereophonic, and Dolby identification of these wrongs. We're going to be freeing ourselves from our resentments by forgiving those wrongs. And we need to know precisely what they are. And therefore, at this stage, we are not looking at our own wrongs, in spite of whatever forms may be out there that is directly contrary to the Big Book. The Big Book does not indulge itself in comparative fault. Quite to the contrary, it says, don't do that. Don't do that. We look at those who have harmed us first. Then we apply the spiritual remedy to our resentments. Then we look at ourselves without reference to what was done to us in the past, because we must be responsible precisely for what we have done. Now, having done that, we go down to the bottom of page 65, We went back through our lives. Nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. And that thoroughness is critical as well as the honesty. Remember now, we're going back to what we hear every time we hear chapter 5 read. We can't recover if we're unwilling or unable to be honest with ourselves. And right here, in this fourth step, this honesty is paramount. We've got to get absolutely honest with everything that took place in our lives if we're to recover. We can't leave anything out. We can't walk around ignoring things. And when we get to our fifth step, sometimes we have to be pulled up short, because there will be things that we have refused to write about and we refuse to talk about. That has to be taken care of before we can move on. When we were finished, we considered it carefully. The first thing apparent was that this world and its people were often quite wrong. Notice the use of the word wrong in that sentence. To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. That's the second use of wrong. The usual outcome was that people continued to wrong us and we stayed sore. 3 times in a row. Wrong, wrong, wrong. People have wronged us. We have to get this through our heads here. This is what we're looking for, because the wrongs that were done to us are the root of our resentments. The usual outcome that people continue to wrong us, we stayed sore. Sometimes it was remorse. And then we were sore at ourselves. Remorse means that we are sorry and remorseful for the things we have done. And this sore at ourselves really is the remorse and guilt that we feel. But the more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got. We all can identify with that. As in war, the victor only seemed to win. Our moments of triumph were short-lived. Most of us, I suspect, and certainly it's true in my case, were plotting revenge right from the time we were little kids. I used to have fantasies about what I was going to do to that dirty so-and-so who did those things to me. And those were wonderful fantasies. And almost always they involved my being some kind of a superhuman person who could take revenge with impunity and laugh all the way home. And to some extent, most of us tried to get revenge, get back at. Do unto others before they can do unto you. All that nasty stuff. The problem is, of course, that this revenge stuff occupied our minds. It swamped us. Here's what the Big Book says. It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. We're taking each day and throwing a trash can, flushing it down the john. It is our resentments which are ruling our lives. Later, the Big Book tells us that these resentments really dominated us. But with the alcoholic, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience. And remember that Bill used the term spiritual experience. Later, when the editorial committee got hold of the 12th step, they changed that to spiritual awakening in the 12th step only. But the meaning of spiritual experience here is the sum result, the net result of working the steps, which in the 12th step we call a spiritual awakening. That this business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal. Why? How can it be that these resentments would be fatal? Well, go back to basics. We have an incurable, always fatal and progressive illness, and our only hope of recovery is to have a loving God stand between us and the booze. And therefore, when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit. When we are shut off from the sunlight of the Spirit, we have no chance. Remember, the Big Book tells us we have but 2 choices: to go on to the bitter end or to accept a spiritual way of life, a spiritual solution. So, when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit. The insanity of alcohol returns and we drink again, and with us to drink is to die. Now, where is this stuff going to be ameliorated? Well, we certainly know that by the time we reach the 10th step, these things will have been corrected. We know that when we reach the 10th step, we will have entered the world of the Spirit, therefore no longer blocked off from it, and we will have been restored to sanity. We're no longer insane. And the problem of alcohol will have been removed. It won't exist for us. And we will have become God conscious. All of these things are going to happen because we work the steps. We must, because with us to drink is to die. Go back to basics again. If our only hope of recovery is to put a loving God between us and the booze, anything that stands in the way between us and God is a killer for us. That's the basic, simple truth of it. This next paragraph is something that the human solutionists hate. They hate this paragraph, because their idea is that all things which are natural are okay, and they consider that it's natural for us to get angry. Nevertheless, what does it tell us here? And this, by the way, is the truth. If we were to live, we had to be free of anger. Now that's to live as opposed to die. If we were to live, we had to. What does had to mean? It means or else. We had to be free of anger. The grouch and the brainstorm, those are the brainstorm is a sudden burst of anger, not the bright idea. The grouch and the brainstorm were not for us. They may be the dubious luxury of normal men. But for alcoholics, these things are poison. Poison. A killer. If somebody says to you, oh, well, of course there's appropriate anger, you must ask them, gee whiz, is there such a thing as appropriate strychnine? I think not. This is not an insoluble problem. Obviously, we're going to have anger come up. We were going to feel threatened out there, and we get angry when we feel threatened. But we have tools to deal with that anger when it crops up. The 10th step is our tool, and it's right there in the 10th step, and it tells us what to do. Be on the lookout for this stuff. When it comes up, take care of it. Inventory it, talk to somebody about it, and ask God to remove it. And if as a result of getting angry you've hurt somebody, make amends promptly. And then turn your thoughts to someone you can help. These are the tools that we have. 4th, 5th, 7th, and 9th steps are right there for us to use. If there's any doubt about what the big book is doing here, it's teaching us how to find what's wrong with us. What's wrong with us? Teaching us how to find, to watch out for, to write down and to inventory our defects of character, the ones that are the master defects. And these are resentment, dishonesty, selfishness, and fear. Resentment, dishonesty, selfishness, and fear. Exactly the same defects mentioned in the 10th step is what we watch out for as we go through each day. Exactly the same defects that we inventory every night in our 11th step inventory. All of the other twists and turns of our character, all the other things that we find objectionable about ourselves will flow from or be included within these 4. Now when we're doing our 4th step, we're trying to find out what all this insanity is. If you want to have a synonym for defects of character, call it insanity. What it means is that our brains have stopped working right. And we're powerless over this. That's what it means when it tells us that lack of power is our dilemma. Our powerlessness is not just powerlessness over alcohol, but powerlessness over our thinking. And so in the 4th step, we're going to be looking at those 4 defects, the cardinal defects. The first part, which we've already studied, we look at resentments. Not only do we look at resentments, but we learn how to be free of resentment. We learn the spiritual remedy for resentment, so that when we finish our 4th step, we don't have any resentments left. The ones we came in here with are gone. Remember that we do not compare the fault of others with our own faults. These are handled separately. We do not indulge ourselves in comparative fault. We do not allow ourselves to pick up on this human concept, which is designed to talk us out of our resentment, saying, oh, they did the best they could, and no wonder, you poor thing, you did that, look what they did to you, and so on and so on. And we grasp these things like a drowning man would grasp at a floating barrel coming by. We love it. Give me some excuse. Give me some reason to say I'm really not responsible. And all those folks out there, they're not responsible either. They treated me shabbily, but then look what I did to them. And so therefore, it's easy to say, well, since look what I did to them, then therefore I may not, I cannot, it is wrong and impossible for me to resent them. And that's total hogwash. Resentments don't depend at all upon rational thought, upon reason. A resentment is something which springs from our fears, springs from the threats that we experience. We don't think it through. We don't say, now I'm going to have a resentment. Now I'm going to get angry. Man, it happens. Any more than we would have to stop and think, that's a beautiful girl, or that's a really handsome man. I think I'll get sexually aroused. Okay, sexual arousal. We don't have to do that. We're dealing with instincts here. This stuff doesn't operate with rational thought. It operates below the level of rational thought. That's what instinct means. And so we love it when we are given excuses for our crapped out behavior. We know in our own hearts and minds that we made choices based upon self, which caused us to go directly against what we knew to be the right thing. We have violated our morals and our ethics. We violated what we know is the next right thing to do over and over and over and over again. And now somebody's come along saying, oh, well, no wonder you did that, you poor thing. Look what they did to you. That, of course, is the antithesis of our program, is it not? When we were studying the third step, remember what we found, that our problems of our own making, that they arise out of ourselves. That alcoholics are an extreme example of self-will run riot. There's any doubt that that's true. Over and over again, the big book tells us the same thing. That we're faced with a self-imposed crisis. And that therefore it was necessary for us to begin to acknowledge the existence of a higher power. That our troubles are of our own making, that God didn't do it. You see, these are basic concepts in here. And they are more often honored by their being ignored than by being used. Because so often we would like to give advice, not help somebody get back to basics and see what's really going on. So we found our resentments, and we have done that which is necessary to be freed from our resentments. The second part of the fourth step is where we look at our own faults. Now this particular part of the fourth step is designed to elicit our knowledge of three of the four cardinal defects: dishonesty, selfishness, and fear. And as we examine these parts of our psyche, we examine this part of our brain functions, as we examine this part of our natural instincts gone awry, we're going to be able to identify those things about ourselves which let us see clearly that we in the past have been dishonest, that we have been selfish, and that we have operated out of fear. And one of the things that's going to be most clear here when we do this part of the fourth step is that the things that we did not work. Here's basic stuff again. If you want to know how to boil this program down to its essentials, with God's help, we stop doing the things that did not work. And with God's help, we start doing the things that will work. And when we start doing the things that will work, our whole life changes. So here in the fourth step, we're finding out what didn't work. Not only that, but when we do this second part of the fourth step, what are we going to do? We're going to find out who, or is it whom we have harmed by our conduct in the past. Not only are we going to find out whom we have harmed, but we're also going to begin to be ready to make amends to these people. In other words, here in the fourth step, we're going to do our 8-step list. The third part of the fourth step deals with our fears. It is designed for us to find out each and every one of our deep-seated fears. And we may get to that tonight. I hope we will. And we'll go through the standard list of fears that almost everybody carts in the door with them. And you may identify with some of these. Not only are we going to learn what these fears are, we're going to write them down. We're going to examine them. We're going to see what was the threat. What is it that caused me to feel fearful? And then we're going to apply a spiritual solution to the fears once we have uncovered them and written them down. So now we've accounted for resentments, dishonesty, selfishness, and fear. Fear again. Now we go to the fourth part of the fourth step, which is our sex inventory. Sex inventory, everybody goes, oh wow, okay. I used to refer to it as sex crimes, but people objected to that. Our sex inventory is designed specifically to elicit our intimate knowledge of ourselves in two areas: selfishness and dishonesty. But it's also designed for us to find out whom we have harmed by our sexual conduct, or in our sexual relations, or even in our relationships with other people up to today. We get to identify those whom we've harmed by our conduct. Out of our selfishness and dishonesty and fear, whom have we harmed? And we get to write those names down, and we get to become willing to make amends to them. We're completing our 8-step list right here. Another thing that happens in the fourth part of the fourth step is that we get to prepare, with God's help, an ideal for how we wish to live our future sex life. Not our ideal for a partner. Most people get confused about that. It had nothing to do with the ideal man or woman who's going to come and be so kind and loving to us and be rich and, have all these wonderful qualities, treat us like a queen or a king, all that stuff. That's got nothing to do with it. This is about us, and it's about how we are to conduct ourselves in the future. It is our ideal for our future sex life. We get to craft that with God's help. So now we can see that we have had a good hard look at all 4 cardinal defects. Now here are the results of doing a proper fourth step. Number 1, we lose our resentments, the one we came in here with. Does not mean that we won't have more resentments come up. Of course we will. That's why we have a 10th step. The world and all of its people will continue to threaten us. And therefore fear equals anger, and anger transmutes itself into resentment. So we know we're going to get more resentments. The 10th step gives us a reprise of the tools that we're learning here, so we can go back and take care of these resentments when they come up. We're going to commence to outgrow fear. We're going to have an ideal for our future sex life. We're going to have a list of all the people we've harmed, and we're going to have a list of all of our defects of character. These 5 things will result from a proper 4th step. Now then, let's go to page 67, and we will consider the second part of the 4th step, which is the list of our own faults. In the center of the page, referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely looked for our own mistakes. Notice, please, that the Big Book has put a steel wall between the wrongs of others, which we've already covered in our resentment list, and the list of our own faults, our own mistakes. They're not brought together in any way. If you have a form that requires you to do that, I would suggest you think seriously before you use it, because it is directly contrary to the Big Book. And there's a very good reason for that. We've discussed it before, but briefly, the reason is that if we blur the edges, we never really see what our wrongs were, and we never fully identify the wrongs of others. We might just as well not have done this at all. What we end up with is an excuse for our bad behavior, an excuse for their bad behavior, and so what? This is the kind of stuff that we've been engaging in up till now. We got to cut it out, because this inventory must be precise, thorough, honest, fearless. We're getting down to the root causes of our disease here. We're getting down to the root causes of our alienation from our higher power. And we must do that if we are to be set free. We have no choice here. This is one of those or else situations. Anything that dilutes the effect of the fourth step is a serious problem for us, because we're dealing here with life and death. We do not want to take Hazelton and treatment centers and Joe and Charlie and that whole bunch out there with these forms. Don't take them seriously. They don't know what they're doing. They must not, or either that they haven't read the big book, or maybe it goes both ways. I'm not sure. But as long as we follow these directions in this book, we know it's going to work. 5 million members of Alcoholics Anonymous in 65 years tells us it works. What the heck more do we need to know? If you have a 4th edition of the big book, you'll find that with all their wisdom in New York, with all the various conferences that have been held and all the various delegates that have been up there, and all the pressure here and there to modify or change the big book, not one word was changed. So now, what are we going to do? Let's go on. We're going to resolutely look at our own mistakes. We're going to look for 4 defects here. One of them is 3 defects. One is combined into 2. We're going to write these down, and we're going to use our resentment list as the basis for this. In other words, we're going to go back to the resentment list, and simply for the convenience of having the names there, we're going to use that as the framework upon which we're going to hang our own inventory. We're going to ask ourselves, with respect to each of the people on our resentment list, the following questions. Where had I been selfish? Where had I been dishonest? Where had I been self-seeking? And where had I been frightened? I want you to notice the use of the word where. This question is not was I. It's where was I? It requires a narrative answer. You know, like we keep saying this over and over again, it's necessary in reading the big book to parse every sentence. Each word is important. Each word carries meaning. Each word, each phrase, each sentence, each paragraph. And so we're going to write out a narrative statement. Let's just take an example. At the top of our list we find Papa. With respect to Papa and my relationship with Papa, where had I been selfish? Now I write that down. With respect to my relationship and the time I spent with my Papa, where had I been dishonest? Where had I been self-seeking? Self-seeking implies an action. The actions arising out of self, where we took action to feather our own nest. And finally, with respect to my relationship with Papa, where had I been frightened? In other words, where had he threatened me, or where had I felt threats from the outside that had to do with Papa? Being alienated from him, for example, or separated from him. And we answer those 4 questions with respect to each of the people on our resentment list. And then we go on down. Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. What more clear statement do we need? That there is a clear and absolute separation between this part of the 4th step and the resentment list. We do not combine them, because when we do, we lose so much of what we need to uncover. The next question, now there are 5 questions in this part. With respect to my relationship with Papa, where was I to blame? This is a question that's going to come with us in one form or another for the rest of our lives. For example, when we get to the 11th step, the inventory we take each night, we're going to ask ourselves, what could I have done better? This is a question that requires self-seeking and strict honesty. Where was I to blame? We're not looking here for an indictment. We're looking here to see what were my actions which contributed to the failures of this relationship. What were my actions which contributed to my unhappiness in this relationship? What were the failures that contributed to the harm and the unhappiness of the other person, which were my responsibility? Goes on to say this: the inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. Nothing could be more clear than that. We're not doing this in our heads. Now this last sentence, it's easy just to slip past this, but let's stop and see what it's saying. We admitted our wrongs honestly and were willing to set these matters straight. You see, here's the first indication of our 8-step list, isn't it? We found out whom we've harmed by going through this list. There may be some others that are not on our resentment list, and we're going to pick them up later. But for right now, we're getting a huge head start on our 8-step list. We admitted our wrongs honestly. That means the wrongs that we committed toward other people, which we can assume had harmed them in some way, and we're willing to set these matters straight. 8-step, isn't it? That's the 8-step. And so when we get to the 8-step, we're going to have most of this stuff done. Now that is the second part of the 4-step, and from this now we have identified fear, dishonesty, and selfishness. We've also identified the people we've harmed, and we have become willing to set matters straight if we can. The third part of the 4-step is our fears list. We're going to inventory our fears. Notice that the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties of Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, employer, and the wife. That's referring to the resentment list on page 65. Listen to this now. This short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. What a fantastic word picture that is. An evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. I like to think of it this way. Look here, let me show you. If we consider that we would want our lives to be a magnificent tapestry, which we could hang on the wall, and everyone could see our lives, see how beautiful they were, and what we had done in life. And we wanted this tapestry to be representative of a good life, of a sober life, of a moral life. We would want this tapestry to be something that our family and our friends and our associates would be proud of. They'd say, I know that person. I know that Jim. Look at the tapestry of his life. What in fact happened? Let's assume that the warp and the woof of this tapestry, those are the large threads upon which the colored threads are hung, horizontally and vertically, warp and woof. Let's say that the warp and woof of this tapestry we were weaving of our life was fear. And every time we tried to weave a coherent picture of some part of our life, fear got to it and that picture was skewed out, or it rotted away, or the colors ran, and you could never see anything that made any sense. All you could see would be one failure after another. This is fear. Let's put fear in another perspective. It may very well be, and I believe this with all of my heart, fear is my only enemy. I believe that fear, if there is a devil, fear is his name, certainly one of his names. I believe that fear is so insidious because it is the antithesis of faith. Now, how am I to ever have a life in a world which is controlled was formed by and is controlled by a loving God, if I have absolutely no faith in that God and am unwilling under any circumstances to either seek or to do His will, where is it that I am going to have even the slightest chance? Unless I happen to be one of those who had great wealth, great power, and exercised it and subjected and subjugated everybody around me to my will. And yet, in every instance that I know of, the people who do that eventually come to their own Waterloo. And so, if I wish to be free of fear then, and I do, I have no choice but to look at the possibility, at least, of the growth of some kind of faith that will supplant the fear. Faith and fear cannot live in the same house. And when I came in here, in most cases, most of us were faithless. We may have had the faith of our childhood, which we had long tried to swallow, forget, or deny. Some of us still professed a great deal of faith, and that's wonderful. It may be a great starting place, at least, for what we need to do. But not only do I need to have faith, but I'm going to have to put faith to work, because faith without works is dead. Faith as a state of mind seems to have little or no value. Now, where in the world is this faith going to come from? How is it that I, who am faithless, when I come in the door, scared to death that there might really be a God out there because I know that He must hate me, certainly is out to get me. The next lightning bolt over the Everglades is meant for me. How am I supposed to turn from that to acquire faith? All through the big book is the same message, over and over and over and over and over and over again. Give up, for God's sakes, give up. Say, God, it is you who are in charge of this. You are the Father. I am the child. What do you want me to do next? Here I am. Use me. What in the world did we say in our third step prayer? We may have just gone right by it because we just thought that was something you mouth so you get on to the fourth step, or at least get your sponsor off your back. That isn't it at all, is it? That I'm offering myself to thee to do with me and build with me as thou wilt. No exceptions, no reservations. And then we had to say, like Bill said, you know, he said I learned that I had to pray just as if there were a God. And when all those miracles started coming, I could no longer deny that they came from a place greater than myself. They came from God. That's when faith came. He was right. And that's what happens with us too. That's why the last word in Dr. Silkworth's opinion is pray. This is coming from that great agnostic Dr. Silkworth. Why? Because he saw that that's what worked. All right, so we're going to want to supplant fear with faith. But that may be a little bit down the road yet. So right now we've got to say, well, yeah, but I got all these fears. What am I going to do about them? Big Book says never fear. Oh, probably doesn't say it. It says, don't panic. Maybe doesn't even say that. It says, okay, look, here's the solution. Be patient. There is a solution. And the solution is right here on pages 67 and 68 in our big book. Now, I will have to say to you that this is only two legs of a three-legged stool. The last part of the solution we will find in the fifth step. However, most of us sneak. We don't want to wait for the fifth step, so we start using it right away. People I sponsor, I try to make sure that their fears have pretty much disappeared by the time they have finished their fourth step. And it's easy to do because, you see, here's the nice thing about spiritual solutions. Being spiritual, They got all this magical power. They never fail. It isn't like somebody came along and said, oh yeah, I've been reading this book by Dr. Rutherford, who's got PhD, all this stuff after his name, and he says do X, Y, and Z, and it's going to work. And you say, well, maybe. But somebody offers you a spiritual solution, you say, well, gosh, that's going to work. And it will. And all these spiritual solutions work for us. One of the most amazing things is, you know, as we go along through this stuff, and we're working these steps, and we find out what these solutions are, and we work them, and we use them, and they work for us, and then we're talking to our bright-eyed friends, and they'll say, what do you need all that AA crap for? So, well, suddenly we can't remember what we did that got us here. And then we start to balance our lives. And when we balance our lives, we forget all about what we said back in the third step prayer. God, take my life and do what you want with it. Now I'm going to do what I want with it because my friends told me I should. And so what happens here is we get all these wonderful solutions, but if we don't keep using them, we lose them. I don't know, they fade away for some reason. But it's easy, you know, because we've got that beautiful 10th step. That's a step of inspired genius. It takes all these tools and puts them in one place and says, okay, use these every day. You get to practice this stuff every day. It's right here. Use it. Now let's think about fear and what it's done to us. It says the evil and corroding thread. When we were young, we were lied to on a massive scale. Not by people who were trying to lie or intended to lie or wanted to hurt us anyway. At least most of them didn't. They were telling us what they believed because what they had been taught. It hadn't worked very well for them, but they taught it to us anyway. They said to us, if you want to be successful and happy and secure in life, you're going to have to go out and you're going to have to get an education, you're going to have to get a career, you're going to have to make some money, and you're going to have to accumulate some things, and you're going to have to get a lot of people who say yes sir and yes ma'am to you. Learn to control people, learn to influence people, learn to have power over people, learn to have power over your life, be empowered, wear power ties, go to power luncheons, learn how to sit with power, speak with power, and then you'll be just fine. And we believed all that stuff, and it was wrong because it never worked. The trouble is that we got pretty far with it. We got a little bit of a castle built up from some of this stuff, and we thought we were really hot stuff. But about that time, fear started to work and knock down the walls of our castle. This fear was coming at us from all directions. Fear of losing what we had, fear of not getting what we needed, fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of economic insecurity, fear of being punished, fear of being found out for who and what we are. Fear of getting old, fear of death, fear of injury, sickness, and pain. And these fears were in there eating away at us like you know, we weren't even aware of it. It's like having a wooden ship with the termites in it. That's the little shipworms that get inside. You can't see them until the first big storm comes along and the ship breaks apart. And you say, how come? This was a sound ship. You didn't look inside the planks. That's where the worms had just eaten it all out. Or don't go walking into a house in South Florida and a termite inspection in 3 years. The floor will probably fall out from money. Those termites are fear. Now here's what's happened to us, you see. You got to understand that this fear is a powerful force. It even is able to override that which God gave us as our birthright. We were given 3 natural instincts which are meant for the preservation of the species and meant for our good and meant for our survival. We were given the instinct for sex, which is a powerful one, the instinct for society, and the instinct for security. And these 3 instincts, as instincts, operate below the level of conscious thought. They're not something we have any control over. And they're good when they're given to us. And they work well. And then fear comes along, and fear warps and perverts and mashes these instincts into an unrecognizable form of insanity. And by the time we walk in the door, our brains are mush. They don't work right. None of our instincts work correctly anymore. We call these warped instincts defects of character. They are a form of insanity which is so insidious. It's been sneaking up on us for so long, we don't even know how nuts we are. Which is the pure definition of insanity. Because if you know you're nuts, they say you're not really nuts. I've never been able to figure that one out. Maybe you guys have the answer. What's happened then is that these natural instincts have been warped by fear, so that now we have our defects, and we're going to have to be free of them. They block us from God. They destroy us. They destroy our relationships. They destroy our lives. They're a cancer in the soul, and we cannot abide them, and they must go. We have to be free of them. That's what we're doing here in our fourth step, to find out what all this stuff is. And this is what fear has done to us. Every time we feel bad, without exception, there is a fear involved. You're feeling bad, you got some psychic pain, the first thing you ask yourself, okay, dummy, what are you afraid of now? There's a threat there of some kind. We got to find what it is. So we're going to learn how to be free of fear, and we're going to learn how to inventory our fears, and we're going to learn how to write down what caused them, what's the threat, and then we'll learn how to be free of them. Okay. All right, down three lines up from the bottom of page 67. We've learned that fear is an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence is shot through with it. It set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune. And we felt we didn't deserve. But did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? Sometimes we think fear ought to be classed with stealing. It seems to cause more trouble. Now, as always, you see in the big book, when it states a problem, immediately thereafter we are given the solution. This is not true of any other part of our literature. You won't find these solutions anywhere else. You find bits and pieces of them scattered around. The way this big book was written, it was written as an inspiration. So each problem is stated, and thereafter, immediately, we find the solution. On page 68, remember that we're taking a written inventory. We reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper even though we had no resentment in connection with them. We ask ourselves why we had them. Now let's take a look at some of those fears which are pretty common to all of us. And I suppose if we were to be able to take a look at mankind or womankind in general, we would find that these fears run throughout all of the human race. I do not believe that they are unique to us, but nevertheless, these are the fears that we most often will find. The first of these fears, which seems to be the most common fear of all, is the fear of losing what we have. Now, a lot of people seem to be afraid of losing what they have when they really don't have very much, but it doesn't matter, does it? It's still whatever they got, and they don't want to lose it. Much of this fear, by the way, does not mean fear of losing material things. Much of it has to do with losing something or someone where a dependency has developed. And dependencies turn out to be one of the most critical things that we have to deal with. One of the most damaging things we find in our inventory. Because when we are dependent upon other people, or dependent upon circumstances or material things, we find that our dependency on God is very hard to come by. And that what really is happening is that we have made ourselves extraordinarily vulnerable to other people. And yet we continue to stay dependent. How often have you heard somebody say, "But I love him"? Maybe you've even said it yourself. And when I hear that, I say, uh-oh, tilt, we're in trouble now. We got a big problem now. One of the most difficult things to get anybody to understand and agree to and accept is that love is not enough. And there is no such thing as love, which is nothing more than a state of mind. Love which is not expressed is nothing but a bunch of electrons in collision in gray matter. Love which is expressed and acted upon, that's love. Think about it for a second. When we say our third step prayer and we ask God to take away our difficulties so that the victory He gives us over those will allow us to bear witness to those we would help of His power, His love, and His way of life. How are we to bear witness to God's love if we are not acting toward them with love, demonstrating God's love, working in and through us? And thus it is that we find that these dastardly states of mind, which we love to use the word advisedly, love to call love, are really nothing more than a dependency which we have allowed to develop way beyond its last useful life, which may have been years ago. Certainly may have been months ago, and yet we seem to be clinging to it. And we're afraid of losing the object of this dependency. And maybe one of our most important fears, our most damaging fears, is that we will be left high and dry, that we will no longer be able to depend on, especially on this person. And it doesn't seem to matter how many times we've been beaten, or cheated on, or lied to. We can't give it up. Our dependency is so strong. And we're so afraid of losing that which we depend upon that we will go to any extreme to try to keep it. We destroy ourselves in the process of hanging on to these dependencies. And yet the Big Book is pretty clear about it, isn't it? That our dependency has to be on God. If it's on other people, we're not going to recover. Anytime you want to know about somebody that you're planning to get dependent on, you better spend a long time watching to see what they do. You're going to know them by their actions, not by their words. Oh, but I love you. Oh, I'll never love anybody as much as you. You're the sweetest, most wonderful thing. And for sure, next week I'm going to start divorce proceedings. Oh, goody. Another fear that we almost all have is not getting what we want or need or think we need. Our dear friend who wrote the story in the back of the book tells us this way on page 553. She says, I get everything I need in AA. Everything I need I get. And when I get what I need, I find invariably that it's just what I wanted all along. What a wonderful thing. And yet we're afraid that we're not going to have what we need. And it really doesn't have a whole hell of a lot to do with having enough to eat and a roof over our head in most cases. Gosh, no, it's that new car. Or that condo which is closer to the beach. Or maybe that new job where the boss doesn't yell so much. Or maybe just a job. Maybe we've gotten tired of the kind of life we've been leading. We think that this is what is going to make us happy and content and secure, and it never is. Never, 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 never. All of these things turn to ashes in our mouth before we've had them very long. There is no satisfaction. And you know what? We substitute satisfaction for bragging rights. We love to build our egos up and be able to brag about the stuff we have and how we got it. Somehow or another, this is supposed to be a substitute for true happiness and contentment and joy and serenity, and it is not, and it never can be. We are afraid of failure because we have failed so often. We're afraid of rejection because we have been rejected so often. Maybe we haven't been rejected at all, but we've been spending the last 15 years expecting it. One of the most desperately terrible things that can happen to a human being is to be shunned. Think of Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter. Stuck a big A on her chest, and now nobody can speak to her or have anything to do with her or even admit to her presence, and yet she must live here among us. The fear of rejection is a very powerful fear, and we go to any lengths to keep from being rejected. To the contrary, what we want, what we desperately desire, is to be admired, for people to think kindly of us, for us to have 16 invitations for every weekend so that we get to choose the one that we think is the best. We want to be popular, we want to be admired, we want to have all of those trophies and awards, and everybody say how wonderful we are, and we will go to any lengths to get it. Goodness sakes, don't come into an AA meeting and say anything controversial. There's going to be some old alligator back there who'll say, well, that's not the way it was when I came in. Don't you know you just don't drink and go to meetings? You don't drink. If your butt falls off, you put it in a little red wagon, you drag it to a meeting. That's the way you stay sober. So don't mention the big book. God, don't mention the steps. Oh, you can say the third step, that's okay. Everybody kind of likes that because it doesn't really mean anything. Big book says it doesn't mean anything unless we go on to the fourth step. Well, the first step you can mention there, you could be a Texas two-stepper, you know, that's what they do down there. First step, 12-step, first step, 12-step. You get to brag about that one. Man, I was out there, man, I went out there and I 12-step. You should have seen this drunk I 12-step. What happened to him? Oh, I don't know. But I sure 12-stepped the heck out of him. And so we don't want to be shunned. We want to be accepted. We don't want to be rejected. Think about the idiot things we do to avoid rejection. So it's a big fear. A lot of us have a fear of getting old, fat, and ugly. I arrived at old, but I ain't had anything to do with fat and ugly yet. AA police, throw him out. We don't permit hecklers in this group. You're going to have to do 411 steps and bring them to next meeting and read them out loud. Okay. We are very, very afraid that people are going to find out what we're really like or who we really are. How many people in here can honestly say that they do not function in AA room with a AA persona which they have carefully crafted, in which they stick to with like glue so that everybody will know exactly who and what they are? Or that is to say, what their role is, what their character is. We got all kinds of characters around here, you know. Real characters. We don't want people to find out who we really are. We're afraid of it. We certainly don't want them to find out what we used to be. We've been telling lies about that all our life. I remember in Beverly Hills when I was practicing law, and that wasn't good enough. I was a CIA agent in one of the bars. Why? I don't know. Don't ask me why I did that. It wasn't good enough that I was practicing law there. But I figured all those people in that bar were so soused all the time, they wouldn't know whether I practiced law or not. But a CIA agent, now that impressed them. I remember one guy coming up to me one night and saying, "Man, I've got some secrets to tell you. I know some spies. They're right down there in L.A." I said, "Well, okay. Call me tomorrow. We'll go pick them up." On page 24, first full paragraph, it's all in italics. What a lawyer friend of mine in the program always refers to people in the audience as if they were all really stupid. He would say, "That's the squiggly writing." The italics. The fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. So what difference does it make if we're scared of the next drunk? We don't have a choice. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. Here's the rule. We are unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or month ago. We are out without defense against the first drink. So let's give up this idea that fear will keep us sober. It is useful at first. It is useful at first because when we come in here, we are without hope. We are hopeless. We are in terrible condition. But as soon as possible, we're going to substitute a loving God for fear, and faith in that God for fear. So now these are the basic fears that we most of us have. We're going to write down our fears, and then we're going to write down what caused our fears. Now the cause of fear, of course, in almost every instance is going to be a threat of some kind, isn't it? And the world and all of its people will continue to threaten us. That's why we have a 10th step, you know. We're not going to escape from the world just because we've worked the first 9 steps. The 10th step is designed specifically for us so that when fear comes back and warps our natural instincts again and our defects pop up again, that we've got the tools right in our hands to use to be free. That's why we have a 10th step. Sooner or later, there will come a time, if we stick around here for a while, when we'll almost never be in fear, we'll almost never feel threatened, and we will know for an absolute fact that when we feel fear, we're insulting God. We're saying, "God, I don't trust you." But anyway, we're going to write down what we believe caused our fears. Now, one of the things you want to look at when you're doing that is that we're taught, and we believe, most of us, that history always repeats itself, right? Well, that's a deadly thought for us, because every time we have something which faces us today, which is to be consummated or will begin to happen tomorrow or the next day, and we had a bad result from that the last time something like this happened, if we believe that history always repeats itself, we are going to be in immediate fear that we will be having the same bad result we had before. But that's not true. It's not true at all. We also have to look to see if there has been some kind of a threat to our pride, because quite often that will be the trigger mechanism for fear. Whatever it is, we're going to write down what we perceive as the cause of the fear. Now then, that's the problem. We've got these fears, and relying upon the Big Book as we do to continuously lead us in the right direction and give us the solution. Let's go to the second full paragraph on page 68. And these 2 paragraphs I commend to you as being 2 of the most beautiful and powerful and important paragraphs in the whole Big Book. because only tangentially do they refer to fear. These paragraphs deal with you and me in all aspects of our lives. Perhaps there's a better way we think so, for we are now on a different basis, the basis of trusting and relying upon God. Oh, I hope so. I hope so. If we are, we have arrived. This is something. This is it. A basis of trusting and relying upon God. We trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. When we do that, guys, everything works. You want your life to work? Turn it over. Leave the results to God. Do what you need to do. Do what's in front of you to be done. Do the next right thing. Don't hurt another person. Leave the results to God. And look what happens. It will always be something miraculous and beautiful. We are in the world to play the role He assigns. What did we ask for in the third step prayer? Offer to you to do with me and build with me as thou wilt. Unconditional offer. Now this next sentence is really, really important. It applies across the board. Let's set the stage. How many times have you said or have you heard people say, how do I know what God's will is for me? I think maybe I'll just sit down on the couch and surf for a while. And maybe it'll come to me. Because I don't dare do anything if it's not God's will, right? But wait a second. God and the big book have given us an out. Not just an out, but an instruction. And here's what it says. Just to the extent that we do as we think He would have us, and humbly rely on Him, does He enable us to match calamity with serenity. We have no excuse for inaction unless we are morally convinced that at the moment that's what God wants us to do. Sit tight and see what happens. We have no excuse for inaction unless we are morally convinced that at the moment that's what God wants us to do. Sit tight and see what happens. Sometimes that's true. But if we are doing what we are convinced God wants us to do, that's half. But what's the other half? Relying on Him for the result. Then we're going to be just fine. Now we may not always choose wisely. We may not always be right. We learned back on page 87 that this is the case. That from time to time we may do something pretty foolish. But that as time goes by, we will come to rely more and more on the fact that God inspires us. That we are able to be inspired by God. That we will be able to be intuitively aware of what He wants for us. As a matter of fact, when we reach the 10th step, what does it tell us? That we will have developed a vital sixth sense, which means that we are able, under almost all conditions, if we are willing to accept the answer, to find out what it is that God wants us to do. But we have no excuse for inaction. The last paragraph we need to deal with now, and this is a beautiful thing. Listen to this now, because this is the way we live. This is what we get to do, guys. We're no longer hanging out there twisting in the wind. We've got God on our side. We've got this massive power that wants only the best for us. God is spirit. We are spirit. We are of Him. He is of us. We never apologize to anyone for depending upon our Creator. I feel sorry for those in the rooms who do. We can laugh at those who think spirituality the way of weakness. Paradoxically, it is the way of strength. The verdict of the ages is that faith means courage. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God. By the way, this program is not a program for sissies. If we don't have the courage to face ourselves, we can't make it. We never apologize for God. Now we go right back to the third step prayer again. Instead, we never apologize for God. Listen to this now. Instead, we let Him demonstrate through us what He can do. That's what we ask God to do for us in the third step prayer, wasn't it? To make examples of us, of His power, His love, and His way of life, by taking away from us our difficulties. So it tells us here again that we're letting God demonstrate through us what He can do. Now here's the solution to our fears. We ask Him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what He would have us be, and once we commence to outgrow fear. So therefore, let me give you a little formula. This has always worked for you. Fear, recognized and written down, discussed with another person, turned over to God, equals no fear. Fear, recognized and written down, discussed with another person, and turned over to God, equals no fear. And so when we look at the God-given instincts for security, society, and sex, it seems fairly obvious that the instinct for sex is perhaps the most powerful of these three. Now, it's going to vary according to human beings, and it isn't necessary for us to categorize them or put them in any kind of an order. But suffice it to say that we have to recognize that this instinct is extremely powerful. What's the big book call it? The imperious urge. The imperium. You can visualize Napoleon going through the lowlands, or Genghis Khan defeating all of Asia and most of Europe, or the Roman legions. The imperium, the imperious urge, against which we have no defense. We are as powerless over the sex urge as we are over alcohol. Just as powerless over our sex instinct as we are over alcohol, or over resentments or dishonesty, selfishness. All of these things are the products of our minds, and they relate to our instincts. And because they relate to our instincts, we don't have conscious control of them. That's why we're powerless over this stuff. Got to understand this. This is not some metaphysical or esoteric concept, this powerlessness. It's real. Just as real as we are. Our reality is that we have no power over our instinctual responses. Not on our own. Not without help. That's exactly why we're here. Because we've been insane. Our natural instincts, warped and perverted by fear, have stopped working for us. In order for us to be set free from this, we have to have God's help. That's why we're here. In a nutshell. So when we look at the sex inventory, we have to look at it from the standpoint of dealing here with something of enormous power within the lives of our sponsees and, of course, in our own lives. And so if we look at the bottom of page 68, please. The last full partial paragraph, 6 lines up from the bottom of the page. Now about sex. Many of us needed an overhauling there, but above all we tried to be sensible on this question. It's so easy to get off the track. Here we find human opinions running to extremes, absurd extremes perhaps. One set of voices cry that sex is a lust of our lower nature, a base necessity for procreation. And of course, that would be the group that would insist that recreational sex is a sin by definition. And therefore, the only sex we are permitted to have is that sex which is at the right time and for the right purpose and the right motives, which is to create a baby. And if you're doing it other than that, you're sinful. A base necessity of procreation. We don't like to do it. It's dirty, it's nasty, it's rotten, but we have to do it if we want to have kids. And anybody who doesn't believe that is a sinner and is obviously consigned to some hot spot in the lower regions. Then we have the voices who cry for sex and more sex, who bewail the institution of marriage, who think that most of the troubles of the race are traceable to sex causes. They think we do not have enough of it, or it isn't the right kind. They see its significance everywhere. Notice that this was written in 1938 or 1939, long before Playboy. There was a magazine called Esquire, and Esquire had a cartoon, not a photograph, but a cartoon in every issue, a very sexy-looking woman, actually totally pneumatic and beyond the possibilities of any human woman ever looking that way. But you see, what we've got here is a definition of precisely what the sex revolution supposedly started, but this was way before that. Also, it's a reflection of Bill Wilson's disdain, I suppose, for Freudian theory, which insisted that you could trace the root cause of all aberrant mental behavior or physical behavior to some kind of a sexual problem. And Freud made a whole career and founded a whole school of psychiatric practice, at least in part, on that idea. But then it goes on to say this. One school would allow a man no flavor for his fare. That's very 30s. Fare means food, what we eat, and flavor would mean that we don't get to put salt on it or pepper or any other seasoning. We just have to eat it like it came out of the ground or off the cow. One school will allow man no flavor for his fare. In other words, pap, bland, the kind of stuff that the naturists around among us insist that we're supposed to eat. And the other would have us all on a straight pepper diet. Everything that was titillating to the senses would be just fine. We want to stay out of this controversy. Listen to this now. We do not want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. How the hell many times around these rooms do you think anybody pays attention to that? God. What is it that forms the basis of most gossip around here? We all have sex problems. It reminds me, right after it became popular to talk about dysfunctional families, I think that was about 10 or 12 years ago. And I was appalled. I had no idea that we were getting into that because it's irrelevant. Totally irrelevant to recovery. But nevertheless, because the psychodrama people had figured that one out and found and coined the phrase, I suppose that we were going to have to deal with it one way or another. And then I saw a book. The cover, just the cover of the book. It was written by some little master's degree psychologist or something, but it got out in the public somehow or another. And the title of the book was, "I'm dysfunctional, you're dysfunctional, we're all dysfunctional." Wow, that's probably true. We all have sex problems. We'd hardly be human if we didn't. Okay, now that's the problem. What can we do about them? Remember, every time the Big Book states the problem, it always, shortly thereafter, immediately thereafter, gives us a solution. So here's the solution. Next paragraph. Now, this little paragraph of 6 lines contains the fourth part of the fourth step. These are the directions for doing the sex inventory. And it again consists of a series of questions. And these are questions that we need to ask ourselves and to answer in writing. About whom? Well, it doesn't say, except the implication would be that we don't want to leave anybody out. So before we start answering these questions, we're going to need to make a list of all the people we ever had sex with. Now that may be a problem for some of us, some of our sponsees. Others won't have any problem with it at all. If we're talking about people whose names are unknown or were never known or have been forgotten, it would be perfectly permissible to list them as Chicago 1, 2, and 3, and Miami A, B, and C. Because we don't have to have names here. We just need to go back and remember the circumstances. Also, this is just from me now. You can take it for what it's worth. I think it works well. Many people you sponsor will have had a lot of one-night stands, or two-night stands, but short, very short relationships, if you can call them that. Nevertheless, they were sexual contacts. I believe it's quite permissible to lump all of these one-night stands into one category because the answers to the questions are going to be basically the same. Nevertheless, we want as complete a list as possible. There are 2 reasons for this. We don't want to miss anything that may be lurking out there, and a lot of this stuff is subliminal, and we've buried it pretty deeply. Probably some of it we don't remember too much about because we were in a blackout or whatever, but nevertheless we're going to answer the questions the best we can. Likewise, there may be some people out there that we don't remember the names of, but who we hurt significantly. And even though we don't remember their names, we're still going to have to do something to make amends for the harm that we've done. So we're going to, in one way or another, we're going to identify them. And now, once we've done that, we've got questions here that we must answer. So we're going to answer these questions in writing, and we're going to answer them some of them in a narrative form, just as we answered the questions in our resentment inventory and in our inventory of our own faults. Some of these questions we will see are yes and no. But we're going to answer these questions as best we can about everybody on our list. Now we're going to answer the questions on page 69 in the first full paragraph, about a third of the way down the page. We reviewed our own conduct over the years past. Now here are the questions. And notice that the sentence begins with the word where. It does not ask us, was I? It asks us, where was I? Selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? So now the way we're going to answer this is, let's assume that the first on our list is Mr. or Ms. X. Now with respect to X, where had I been selfish in my relationship with X? So we're going to write down our actions and our motivations and our attitudes that were selfish. When we finish that, we go back to X again. With respect to X, where had I been dishonest? Again, a narrative description of our dishonesty, our dishonest motives, our dishonest actions, our dishonest attitudes. And finally, with respect to X, where had I been inconsiderate? of course, we recognize, I hope, that inconsiderateness, being inconsiderate, is simply another expression or a part of our selfishness. Now the next question, with respect to X, whom did I hurt? Did I hurt X? Now this is a pretty important question, because a lot of times in the state of mind that we had before we came in the room, before we started getting honest with ourselves, our first inclination would be to say, well, she knew what she was getting into, or he had no doubt about what was going on, and he was just as guilty as I was, and I don't think I hurt him at all. And we can rationalize just about any action based on that. So you got to be careful of that with your sponsees. There's a better way, the way to look at it. This is the way we look at all of our 8-step, not just here, but across the board. If that was done to me, would I be hurt? See, that's the only true test we have. Because the moment that we begin trying to guess whether the other person would have been hurt by our actions, we put ourselves beyond the pale. That's fertile ground for rationalization and denial and self-delusion. So we're going to ask ourselves, whom had I hurt? And the test is, if what I did would have hurt me, I'm going to write down their names. Now with respect to X, did I unjustifiably, a very interesting word. Of course it means exactly what it says, but we have to again be careful of justification. Self-justification is one of our many character flaws. It's easy for us to justify our actions based upon our perception of what others have done to us, or upon what we are entitled to. You know, people have pumped us all through with this idea of entitlement, and that we're supposed to have this, we're supposed to have that, we're supposed to be happy. People are supposed to treat us in a certain way, and on and on. If they do not, then it is justified for us to retaliate. Now, if we start to think about this justification from the standpoint of retaliation, then we understand what it really means. Retaliation we ran into back in our resentment list, didn't we? And all the way back in the 3rd step, that we step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate, seemingly without provocation. In the 4th step, in the resentment list, and we looked at the solution to resentments, we realized that we had spent a lot of time retaliating, justifiably taking action against others whom we resented. It's the same kind of thing that we hear from the human solutionists, who tell us that some anger is justified, some resentments are justified. What that ignores absolutely is that the anger or the resentment blocks us from God and will kill us. Who cares if it's justified or not? The justification is something that we whomped up. Now then, when we look at this, unjustifiably, there was no reason for us to do the things we did. We had no possible justification for it. See, this is just the opposite of being justified, isn't it? Unjustifiably, we had no right to do these things. We were not permitted. Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Think about that. I'm going to get back at you. I'm going to make you jealous. I'm going to get back at you. I'm going to let you see what the bitter taste of a love affair gone sour can be. You get to suffer along with me. I'm going to make you suspicious just as you've made me suspicious. Now, of course, justification for bitterness, suspicion, and jealousy is that the other person has done something to us. Or, even worse, that these are techniques that we use for control. We've learned how to push the hot buttons of the other person. If we want to control Mr. X, we make him jealous. Now he will pay a lot more attention to us. If he suspects maybe that we're doing something behind his back, maybe he'll pay more attention. Maybe we'll drag him into our fold even more. You see, what we've been taught right from the time we were kids is that we build a castle. And when we have a relationship with somebody, we bring them into that castle and we take them captive. And there are all kinds of ways of doing that. None of these are justified in the sense that there is no spiritual justification for it, especially in light of the fact that by doing this we harm ourselves probably even more than we harm the other person. Especially in view of the fact that to do this we have to blind ourselves to the realities, to the truth about us. Remember, again, see, all this stuff ties together. Every time you hear chapter 5 being read, the first paragraph tells us that we cannot recover if we're unwilling or unable to be honest with ourselves. This is another indication that we have been self-deluded, that we've been dishonest with ourselves, and these are things that we have to deal with. And this dishonesty is the dishonesty that the Big Book talks about. Seldom do we have even the slightest indication that the Big Book is talking in terms of honesty, is talking about cash register honesty. It's talking about self-honesty. All the way through, the criteria for recovery is that we be honest with ourselves and with God and with another human being. But it all starts with self-honesty, and it all starts right here in the fourth step. Next question is another question we must answer in narrative form. Where were we at fault, and what should we have done instead? These are questions which are precursor to what we're going to be doing every day of our lives when we get to our 11-step inventory. We're going to be looking at our day and see what we could have done instead. We're going to see what our next action should have been. We're going to see where we've gotten off the path. Where were we at fault, and what should we have done instead? Extremely important questions. Now, this is with respect to Mr. or Ms. X. We're going to answer those same questions all the way down the line with everybody on our list. And we got this all down on paper and looked at it. In this way, we tried to shape a sane and sound ideal for our future sex life. We subjected each relation to this test. Was it selfish or not? Does that give us a clue as to what the critical factor in this inventory is? Of course it does. It's selfishness. Go back to the third step again. So our troubles we think of our own making. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot. Driven by 100 forms of fears, self-delusion, self-seeking, we stepped on the toes of our fellows and they retaliated. In other words, it's quite clear that the essence of the failure of our relationships with other people have been our selfishness and our self-centeredness and our self-centered fear and our self-delusion. And we're going to find that out as we do this inventory. We subjected each relation to this test, was it selfish or not? Notice also that we're trying to shape a sane and sound ideal for our future life, future sex life. This does not mean our ideal mate. It has nothing to do with him or her out there. It has only to do with us. And in answering these questions, we have paraded the horribles. We have found out about ourselves. We have identified those things which have caused the failures of our relationships in the past. We've identified those actions and those motivations and those attitudes which have harmed others and have meant that we have never had that complete and satisfying and normal and rational and sane relationship with another human being. We're going to see that selfishness was involved in our relationships, that we were dishonest as a result of it, and that we never had a chance because the selfishness blocked God out of the equation. And as we go through the 8th and 9th chapters in the big book, the chapters that deal with the wives and the family afterward, we find out how critically important it is in a relationship to have a spiritual basis for it. One of the things that we're going to see, if we don't see it here, we're going to see it eventually, that where one person in a relationship is growing spiritually and the other one is not, that relationship is bound to fail. They may not break up, but they'll be damn miserable if they don't. They'll be damn miserable if they do. One thing that becomes apparent also is that when we craft this ideal, we are not only doing so for our future sex lives, but that this has carryover into our relationships with all people. We're going to be looking toward maintaining relationships unselfishly, without doing things to further our own aims, to feather our own nest, without having a relationship for what we can get out of it, but rather for what we can put into it. Unselfishness equates to loving giving, without demand of any kind for a return. When you can have that with another human being, you got something that's priceless. There's no way you can measure it on any scale. It's priceless. We ask God to mold our ideals and help us live up to them. This is the keynote for this whole section. Not only have we found out what was wrong with us and whom we harmed, but we've found that we must take this to God and ask Him to show us how He would want us to live our lives, to mold our ideals. We don't try to do this alone. It's not a bad idea when you're working with your sponsees to have them write this ideal down in the form of a prayer. God, this is the ideal I have for my conduct in my future sex life. I need your help with this. I know that I'm powerless in many of these things, and please be with me and shine your light on me and show me how to live up to this ideal. And that works very well. This next sentence is so important to understand. We remembered always that our sex powers were God-given and therefore good. God-given and therefore good, neither to be used lightly or selfishly, nor to be despised and loathed. And this means that regardless of the direction of our sexual orientation. The moment that we understand that our sex powers are God-given and therefore good, it relieves us of all of the anxieties, all of the terrors, and all of the people out there in society who do not understand that our sex powers are God-given. Now we can relax. But the one thing that we need to understand is that this principle only applies if we approach each sexual encounter or relationship unselfishly. And if we do not take them lightly. Remember that when we engage in sexual activities, we irrevocably change both parties. It'll never be the same relationship again. And each person who is a party to a sex relationship has the same kind of reaction, even though it may not be readily apparent. It's going on nevertheless. And because there are these significant changes in this radical influence of the sex act on others, we can understand why for us to engage in this lightly, as if it was of no consequence, can cause irreparable harm to the other person as well as to ourselves. Nor to be despised and loathed. God, we spend so much time in guilt-ridden about these things. One of the things that we always ask, and we'll be talking about this next week, or soon anyway, in our fifth step, as if we're hearing somebody's fifth step, before we are finished, we ask them, is there anything at all that we haven't talked about that is so disturbing to you that you're never going to allow another person to know about it, something you're going to carry to your grave? You don't have to tell me what it is, but you must tell me if something like that is still unspoken here, if you've been hiding it. About half the time, that will exist, and we have to ferret it out. Most of the time, there are two areas that are going to be of this disturbing. One is going to be some sort of criminal activity, which has never been discovered and goes unpunished, and the other will be homosexuality, and usually an isolated act when the person is a child. And this can be something that's been weighing on the person's mind all these years. So we know the power of this loathing and despising of our sex powers. It's very important that we help our sponsees to come past that. Now then, let's go to the next paragraph. Whatever our ideal turns out to be, we must be willing to grow toward it. We're going right back to this same ideal. Everybody understand that. This is the ideal we crafted with God's help.
What do you think about, I'm sitting here thinking that our personal relations and sex relations are not as different as they were back in 1935.
Heck no, this stuff never changes. Are you kidding?
What I mean is the difference between there's sex relations and there's personal relations with other people, but they're getting less and less different as time goes by.
What are you postulating here? Some kind of an androgynous individual?
Where's this world going to?
Crazy, go back to sleep.
I don't know why. I was
Help him out, will you, Debbie?
I give up on him.
Now then. Holy cow, I don't know where this hour and a half goes.